Donald Trump is heading back to the White House.
Together we can truly make America great again.
We are in for an unpredictable but fascinating 4 years.
And we're going to be following every twist and turn for the first 100 days. We'll be bringing you the latest updates and analysis first thing every morning. So join me, James Matthews.
Me, Martha Kelnick.
And me, Mark Stone.
For Trump 100, every weekday at 6 a.m, wherever you get your podcasts.
Hello, good morning, and welcome to Politics with Sam and Ant, the podcast that gives you everything that you need to know about the day ahead in British politics in under 20 minutes. And welcome into the light Sue Gray, who officially becomes a legislator, a peer, and hence a public figure, with her salary automatically disclosed as she's introduced into the House of Lords later today after years in the back room and of government and Labour and in the shadows.
Yes, she is swapping that leather jacket for ermine. Baroness Gray of Tottenham will no doubt faithfully follow the Labour whip. It's Tuesday, February the 11th, 2025. My name is Anne McElvoy from Politico with Sam Coates of Sky News.
It's got the feeling of a fairly typical day ahead in Westminster. There's a cabinet meeting this morning, which will no doubt touch on the ongoing tariff threat from Donald Trump. There's a weekly YouGov poll for Sky News and The Times, and that's broadly unchanged. Reform 26, Labour 25, Tory 21, Lib Dem 14, Green 9. But that's a 5-point gap between the Tories and Reform, which won't be that comfortable for Kemi Badenoch on her 101st day in the job as Tory leader.
But there are two big things we're going to talk about this morning. The sudden big changes to the assisted dying bill fronted by Kim Leadbeater, and whether Keir Starmer can really deliver his promises to end future bat tunnels. The country waits with bated breath, as well as the latest on tariff wars.
And just a little bit of fun before we do all of that, because we've got a little beltway scoop for you from friend of the podcast, Sky's chief political correspondent, Jon Craig, whose voice I love hearing this early in the morning. His gravelly tones carry such weight. Now, as many listeners know, there are multiple bars and restaurants in Westminster, but the most iconic one of all is called Strangers. And that's, it's sort of a traditional pub, but it leads out onto that Commons Terrace right next to the River Thames. And that has been shut for a few weeks after an alleged spiking incident. But that's where Jon can pick up the story and tell us what's about to happen next.
I've learned that the House of Commons Commission, that is chaired by the Speaker, all the senior politicians like the Leader of the House, the Shadow Leader and so on, have met following the closure of Strangers a few weeks ago after a spiking allegation, drink spiking that is, and it's been decided that Strangers Bar, used by MPs, peers, political journalists, members of staff and so on, will reopen after the half-term break. That'll probably be about the end of February, early March.
That's Jon Craig. That news will be welcomed, I think, by government whips, opposition whips. One of the points of Strangers Bar, it just allows the sort of tentacles of the government to keep a bit more an eye on MPs than they otherwise would do, squirreled away on their WhatsApp groups, plotting against party leaders. So Strangers working refreshes the parts of the political system that other bars cannot. Right, let's get on with the serious business of today. Last week, we were talking about, and I was telling you, that there were big concerns in government about one element of the assisted dying bill in particular, which was the promise that was made to MPs as they voted for it last year, that a High Court judge would sign off every single case or where somebody wanted to use the new assisted dying legislation. Every single case, we were told. But there were problems with it because it was felt that judges can't investigate every single case. They're not investigators. So would it just become a rubber stamping exercise? How would it work? How would it work when the court system is under such pressure? All of these problems mounting up. And then last night, it emerged that actually there is going to be proposed a major change to this legislation partway through its passage in Parliament. And do you want to explain what Kim Leadbeater is suddenly now proposing?
Yes, Samuel, she wants to scrap the High Court sign-off on all assisted dying applications. And the problem there is that this really was a key element of the legislation, along with the requirement of that 2-doctor sign-off to reassure people that it couldn't be abused. Now, she has put forward a different proposal called Judge Plus, but really it sounds a bit more like Judge Minus, and that would be that a new panel of experts, including psychiatrists, legal workers of different levels, etc., would now approve the assisted dying request. The reason for that, Sam, is that Ministry of Justice officials had raised concerns about these applications clogging up the courts. They said they simply didn't have the judicial bandwidth to go with the original plan. There's a very interesting line on this in Politico's playbook this morning. 28 MPs would need to switch from a yes to a no vote if they were so minded on this issue to sink the legislation at the third reading. We know that around 61 MPs said in the second reading that this High Court safeguard was a key reason to support the bill. Well, some of them may be convinced to make the change, but some may not. As always, it's going to be about the numbers.
It's quite important, I think, to just dissect exactly the change that Kim Leadbeater seems to be putting forward. So, under the old proposal, a High Court judge would sign it off. Now, a 3-person panel chaired by a lawyer that might be a judge, or probably isn't a judge in most cases, will actually do that function. And the other 2 spots will be something like a social worker or a psychiatrist. Now, advocates of this proposal say this allows greater expertise at a critical moment in the process. Critics of it will say this is a major change after the moment that many MPs voted for it and does remove a High Court judge. Before we get into the parliamentary impact, I just want to pick up one thing that's niggling away at me, and you referred to it just there, Anne. And it's the way that Kim Leadbeater was trying to present this last night. Now, whatever you think of this plan, and there are clearly arguments for and against it, it strikes me that trying to brand this, trying to spin this as Judge Plus when it's Judge Minus, just in of itself feels like the kind of act that will irritate fellow MPs, because it's a change probably done out of necessity. But I don't think you can really claim that it's a greater degree of judicial involvement. Now, where a judge comes in is that a current or retired judge will appoint these panels, but that actually pushes the judicial element one step further away from individual cases. So I really struggle with this idea that she can spin it, and I was even more concerned, I have to say, Anne, and this isn't about being pro or anti the issue, but it's about politicians' abilities to be absolutely crystal clear on very complex but very important points of law and changes. Now, Kim Leadbeater appeared last night in front of Sophie Ridge in an interview that Sky's going to be playing out today. I just want to read you this bit. Sophie was saying, is the role for judges going to be downgraded? Kim said, I'm not proposing that we take out the rule for the judge at all. There will be a role for a judge. The things that we're looking at to enhance that. So Sophie says, a judge, but not a High Court judge. And Kim replies, no, it would be a High Court judge. Yes, it will be a High Court judge. So we'd keep that. So we'd end up with what you might call a Judge Plus model, where we could have additional expertise in that process. I think if you're going to sell this to MPs, you've got to be pretty accurate and transparent about how you do it. That kind of obfuscation feels to me like it might make things more difficult.
I agree with that. And I think regardless of what one thinks of the substantive point here on assisted dying, Sam, I think there's quite a lot of criticism, and you may have heard it too around the Palace of Westminster on the drafting. And if you like, the craftsmanship of this. Now, that is, of course, if you take a bill that's coming out of backbenches, it hasn't gone through, if you like, through that ministerial kind of thinking process. And it does feel a little bit like it is sort of staggering through the Commons. It'd be very interesting how many, it was interesting, the playbook there did the numbers for us, how many people who said that having that High Court judge directly involved, as you point out, it's being watered down at every step. Shall we put in a word for Kim Leadbeater's thinking here, which is that, as well as the fact it is a virtue of necessity, frankly, there are just not enough judges to do this, it is perhaps intended to be a bit closer to the communities, and she would make the argument perhaps better that this panel would have kind of the time and a multiplicity of experience to understand different situations. But it is not Judge Plus. It just isn't.
That said, I can see that MPs, when they made their decision at second reading about how to vote, will feel like they planted a fairly firm flag in the ground. And I think it's important to say that we just don't know yet whether the changes announced by Kim Leadbeater will actually lead people to change their vote. And I can actually think that whatever they said in their speeches, I think the hurdle is quite high before MPs are seen to change how they voted. They all consulted their communities. They all gave lengthy, very well-considered speeches about this. And so I'm not sure that we can assume that this is curtains for the legislation. It's more like a big black mark. Right, let's move on. Now, one of the big stories of 2025, given that the government has a stable majority, is, well, if you take it at face value, what the government tell us it is, which is growth. And Keir Starmer has been absolutely crystal clear that the way he's going to get growth, he was saying this before the election and after, is major changes to the planning laws to get Britain building again. He's been very punchy on this from the moment he was elected right to a series of changes that were announced a few weeks ago that we've talked about on this podcast. But it's really, really hard to deliver on the rhetoric that he's been saying in speeches, given the massive complexity of the system that he's inherited and must tackle. So I have done something that nobody else seems to have done, which is, together with producer Tom Larkin, we have actually gone and found and filmed the Bat Tunnel.
Exclusive.
The, footage that will be running today on Sky News. But what this is basically a shed costing £100 million that runs for about a kilometre over the proposed route of HS2. And the purpose of this shed is to try and stop bats, Bechstein bats, from the nearby ancient woodland from hitting future high-speed trains. Now, this structure, which is often called a bat tunnel, but it's not a tunnel, has been singled out by Keir Starmer and Rachel Reeves as an emblem of everything that is wrong. And the implication, in fact, they pretty much said this, is that they will never, ever allow that to happen again. But we have done a very deep dive in Sky today looking at whether actually it is that easy to stop these structures in the future. And the truth is, Anne, that we've talked to lawyers, experts, industry professionals, people in government, and despite the kind of very, very punchy rhetoric of the Prime Minister, right now it remains far from clear that the Prime Minister can credibly and definitively say there will be no more bat tunnels.
Can I ask a really searching question, Sam? Why?
For two reasons. First of all, the 2017 legislation that meant that HS2 had to build this structure, otherwise they'd be sued, otherwise they'd be taken to court, is still in force and actually is part of our trading agreement with the EU. If you remember, when we signed the trade agreement with Brussels, we signed up to a whole series of what's...
You mean the last one, right? The recent one?
2021. We signed up to a whole load of what's known as level playing field commitments. In other words, if we want to continue to trade with Europe, we have to promise to uphold environmental standards. That includes the very law that meant that this had to happen. Second reason is the government is looking at some kind of compromise. Maybe developers pay into a fund, into some kind of pot that allows them to avoid having to do things like bat tunnels because they've compensated for nature disruption in other ways. But talking to lawyers and indeed some insiders, they are sceptical that such a compromise would ever allow you to ignore the law. I mean, if you're disrupting bats, how can a fund to save some newts elsewhere actually help? That's slightly trivializing it, but bluntly, it's very, very hard to do. We are still awaiting the fine detail of this, but if the government actually tries to repeal this law, not only will it face trouble in Europe, but it will go to war with the entire environmental movement. And that is something that actually governments tend not to survive if they try.
I was about to say it'll never fly, but I sense that you've heard every bat joke along the way of doing this extraordinary deep dive.
I think that they are working very hard on this in government, and they might come up with a plan in the coming weeks. Certainly the official response from government is, you haven't seen the legislation yet, wait and see. But there's a lot of nervousness because Keir Starmer's ratcheted the rhetoric right up just to the point where he needs maybe to find a compromise that nature groups will respect, but also delivers the planning changes that he wants. And that landing zone is very small. And if he's forced into sort of playing with the nitroglycerin of the actual legislation, the nature rules, which some, particularly on the Tory side, want him to do, he could have a massive, massive fight on his hands. Another way to get growth is through skills. There's changes to that as well today. Anne, do you want to tell us what they are?
Yes, a lot's been made in recent days about Labour taking pages from that Trump playbook in a bid to hold or win back its traditional working class base. Here is the first concrete idea that we've heard from the government on that, and it's on apprenticeship plans, and it is really trying to get more British-born workers into blue-collar jobs, solid blue-collar jobs, unashamedly, says a government spokesman, about giving more opportunities to homegrown talent to build strong careers in skilled trades. Making trades great again is one of the many making greats that's floating about on that. What it means in practice is watering down some of the previous criteria to get entry to those higher apprenticeships, which turned on having GCSE English and maths that a lot of people struggled with. So relaxing, to put it politely, the rules on that and saying that it need no longer apply across the board should pull more people into a stream of apprenticeships. You can argue it pulls against this whole idea of upskilling the population.
I suspect the interesting thing will be what employers end up making of this. Apprenticeships, often controversial because they come with levies, and whilst the chance to have skilled committed workers is important, if they can't ultimately do the jobs that employers want them to do, then there is a mismatch and a problem. And that's one of the reasons that we've ended up looking to foreign workforces if the domestic workforce is not suitable. So that's going to be fascinating. One other big growth story today, Donald Trump pressed ahead yesterday with his announcement to impose 25% tariffs on steel going into the US. But there's been a googly as far as UK is concerned, which is, it appears that Donald Trump has had a phone call with the Australian Prime Minister, Albanese, and they both agreed that Albanese could announce that Donald Trump was considering a carve-out for Australia. Now, that's important because as far as we're aware, there is no carve-out being considered for the UK. I am sure behind the scenes, British ministers and the new ambassador in Washington, Lord Mandelson, will be trying to get such a carve-out because if Keir Starmer is no longer top friend of Donald Trump and it's going to hit our steel industry, 10% of steel exports go to the US and from the UK, then there will be some political pain for that.
It's interesting also that, unfortunately for Lord Mandelson and possibly for Keir Starmer and Rachel Reeves, there does seem to have been a bit of a shift in rhetoric towards the UK. Sam, we were talking only last week about maybe having got, if not a free pass, then a pretty good value pass from Donald Trump on tariffs. But now he is saying, or said recently in a press conference, we have a huge deficit with the UK, having last week said it wasn't such a big deal. So it depends really how he's measuring it. It depends if you're measuring goods or services, but you do sense that there's been a bit of a hardening in Washington towards the UK. Peter Mandelson there trying to pour oil on troubled waters in his first week as ambassador. He's taken an awful lot of oil with him. Too going to need it to pour on some pretty choppy waters.
The UK has also decided not to sign up to President Macron's AI summit conclusions and side with Donald Trump in not doing that. I think the danger is if we end up looking like a supplicant to the US, but getting very little material gained in return, then I think there could be a political price to pay. It just is tricky for Keir Starmer to navigate the sheer level of unpredictability on this at the moment. But this, Anne, you can just about hear it, is the alarm. That means we're done. We've done 20 minutes. Thank you very much indeed. We will be back tomorrow. I look forward to seeing you then.
I'll put the kettle on.
Donald Trump is heading back to the White House.
Together we can truly make America great again.
We are in for an unpredictable but fascinating 4 years.
And we're going to be following every twist and turn for the first 100 days. We'll be bringing you the latest updates and analysis first thing every morning. So join me, James Matthews.
Me, Martha Kellner.
And me, Mark Stone.
For Trump 100 every weekday at 6 a.m, wherever you get your podcasts.